how do we govern ourselves as human beings on the global level? And how did we get to where we are today? And where do we want to go as citizens of planet Earth? In this talk, I'd like to describe how the global governance has evolved over time and show how our origins are pointing us in a direction, and yet the direction is still very uncertain. If you look at the history of our Homo sapiens species from some 250,000 years ago, as hunter-gatherers, we came into small communities. Those became towns, started to organize agrarian societies. The cities became states. And we saw ourselves evolving to larger entities. And of course, there was the constant fear that a neighboring town would attack, that there would be disruption or violence within the community. And so the citizens of the towns would try and form their own self-defense, and gradually they make alliances with other towns and form leagues like at the time when we started recorded history. And probably the best example would be the time of the Greeks, where the citizens of towns would form their own armies, and Athens became a very prominent city-state. And at one point, they wanted to invade Sparta, because Sparta was seen to be a very aggressive warrior state that might attack it. So the Athenians decided they would go and form their armies and attack a neighboring city-state and area, and they formed alliances to do that. And at one point, the Athenian military landed on the island of Milos. And they told the people on Milos, you have a choice. You can either join us or we'll kill you, because we don't want you to join the Spartans. And the citizens of Milos said, no, we want to be neutral in this conflict. But the Athenians gave them no choice, and so they massacred them, men, women, and children. This is described in the Peloponnesian Wars of Thucydides. And we see how the story unrolled, and it was a story of brute force. And as the general told the people of Milos, the powerful, the strong, do what they want, and the weak suffer what they must. This was a statement that right is not making might, but that might makes right, because they would be the ones who'd be writing the history, not a comprehensive history, but the history after the battle. They would describe it the way they wanted, because they would be the victors, at least so they thought, until the end of that Peloponnesian War. And this was a case of brute force. It was the law of the jungle applied to city-states. And we didn't have any form of organization to deal with peace and conflict. There were battles, and this repeated itself for century after century as empires tried to expand, the Romans coming later after the Greeks. And then the various empires came and left as they expanded further and further. And then the Europeans became predominant in the world and started to colonize. And there were the wars of Napoleon conquering other European nations. And the European leaders were so astonished that in what they thought was their advanced civilization, there could be such brutal wars with tens of thousands of people dying in a matter of hours, that they got together in Vienna in 1815, seeking to find a way to resolve the conflicts that were happening in Europe and try and get a peace, so they could spend more time on the arts, on music, and the other activities. But of course, they had a militant tradition as well. And so they decided that they would follow the tradition of balance of power. If countries created militaries and alliances that were so powerful, the other side wouldn't want to attack because they would see that it would be impossible. But you don't want to have one side get too much more power. So this balance of power was an idea that was manifested in the Congress of Vienna and in the council that they created in order to meet occasionally. Whenever there was a dispute, they would get together so that they wouldn't have to fight each other. Now that held the peace for relatively well for almost a century, with a few major conflicts during that period, but it wasn't the major catastrophe they experienced with Napoleon. But then it all broke down in the shot that rang around the world on June 28th, 1914, in Sarajevo, when the Archduke Ferdinand was killed, and the nations of Europe found themselves going into war involuntarily. They had alliances and secret alliances and webs of treaties that caused those countries to automatically be at war, even if they didn't want to be. And Canada was naturally at war because it was a member of the British Empire. And that caused tremendous suffering. 15 million people lost their lives in World War I. And it was a war in which new weapons were being used. As science was advancing, chemical weapons were introduced to deal with trench warfare so that you could get into the trenches of the opposite side. And you could be able to defeat their soldiers and try and break the log jams that were happening where machine guns couldn't penetrate. But that just caused the other side to use chemical weapons. And then with the respirators being used, you got into stalemates in France and Belgium. And so the war was a war of attrition. And the United States was trying to remain neutral in that war because they saw it was a web of intrigue of European countries that had such a long history of fighting wars, and they didn't want to get in. And particularly the U.S. president tried to negotiate for some sort of peaceful settlement. But that wasn't possible. And when Germany announced unrestricted submarine warfare on neutral nations, including the United States, the U.S. went to war. And President Woodrow Wilson asked the Allies, "What are your war goals? What do you want to achieve after this war?" And they said victory. But he said that's not good enough. We have to have a vision for a better world so this doesn't have to happen. Every century, we in the European nations go into major battles. You had wars of 30 years, 100 years, and he was looking for a greater vision that somehow humanity could be able to find a way to find itself with mechanisms to deal with the problem of war. So when he announced the U.S. war aims in January of 1918, he made 14 points. And the 14th point was a general association of nations must be formed under specific covenants for the purpose of affording mutual guarantees of political independence and territorial integrity to great and small nations alike. So a sense of right makes might, that somehow nations have to come together, and when there's an aggressor, they all have to prevent the aggressor from achieving the objectives, rather than forming the alliances which had created World War I. And there was a willingness after World War I, after the fatigue, after families had lost so many members, and after they'd seen the horrors of gassing and the slaughter on the battlefields, they were finally open to finding a new way to resolve the issues of war and peace. And in Paris in 1919, after the end of the war in November of 1918, the three major powers who were discussing the future were Woodrow Wilson on the right, Premier Clemenceau in the middle, and Lloyd George, the Prime Minister of Great Britain, or the British Empire. And they each had different major objectives. In fact, Lloyd George wanted to keep the British Empire intact and gain some new territories because the Germans were losing some of their properties. Clemenceau was afraid that Germany might rise again, and he wanted to create a defense against the German rise. And Wilson wanted a new world order where things were done differently so that the nations of the world didn't have to go to war periodically as they had. And Clemenceau, with his humor, he said, well, Lloyd George, what he really wants to be is Napoleon. He's looking at territorial aggrandizement. And Woodrow Wilson, oh, he wants to be Jesus Christ. And he said, I'm really tired of Wilson and his 14 points. I mean, God himself had only 10. So this was the dynamics of the Paris conference, but Wilson managed to get in the Quai d'Orsay, by the side of the Seine, in the Salle de l'Horloge, a basis for a new world organization. For the first time, humanity was going to create an organization to deal with the peace of the world. And at that point he said, a living thing is born, and we will have to see how we clothe it. And so it was that this idea of international organization was born in February of 1919. And of course there were precedents. Already humanity had created the telegraph, so you could start to communicate with people far away in near real time using Morse code. And you had to know what kind of voltages were on the line, so one country would have the same voltage as the other, and you need to know what codes you were using. But that was created through the International Telegraph Union of 1865. And because people were starting to send letters across borders, the Universal Postal Union was created later on in that century. And now Wilson was proposing an organization not just devoted to a narrow band of communications and mailing, but he's talking about an organization to deal with a piece of the world that would meet continuously and have a headquarters. And he also decided to put it in Geneva, like the ITU and the Universal Postal Union, or UPU. And he brought the treaty back to the United States, but he found reluctance, particularly among conservatives. And the head of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee was Henry Cabot Lodge, the senior senator from Massachusetts, who thought to get the U.S. enmeshed in Europe's intrigues again, to make a commitment through the League that they would come to the defense of the weak, to make a pledge that they would try and prevent future wars by the use of force. That all sounded like a lot of trouble. So he wanted to put on reservations and to make sure that the United States could not be bound by the provisions that had been signed by Wilson in Paris. And the Paris Peace Accord did oblige nations to have some commitment to international peace and security. And Wilson said, if we don't do something now, I can predict that within one generation there will be another world war. And the weapons that the Germans used in the last World War will be like toys compared to the weapons they'll use in the next war. And we have to find a means to deal with this. And he was saying the League of Nations is the hope to prevent that. Well, the League of Nations was created, and in its history, about 60 countries became members of the League. But the United States never joined because it failed to be ratified by the U.S. Senate. So the U.S. was on the outside looking in as the League of Nations was doing its work, and it did good work in the 1990s, prevented some wars, settled some disputes, ran plebiscites. That means elections in certain countries as they were deciding whether they would stay with Germany or become independent or join with neighboring countries. They played a useful role. But when fascism arose in the 1930s, then the League was powerless because there wasn't enough effort in the League of Nations to deal with the rise of brute force again. And when Mussolini, the dictator of Italy, invaded Abyssinia, which is current-day Ethiopia, the emperor of Abyssinia came to the League of Nations and he said, should it happen that a strong government finds it may with impunity destroy a weak people, then the hour strikes for that weak people to appeal to the League of Nations to give its judgment in all freedom. God in history will remember your judgment. It is us today, it will be you tomorrow. And how right he was that soon enough war would engulf all of Europe, and those nations which refused to be able to protect Ethiopia found themselves calling for protection. As the Second World War started with Hitler's invasion of Poland, and already we'd had the Japanese invasion of Manchuria, and so the World War broke out again, and not just 15 million, but 55 million people died as the wars engulfed the planet. Then we saw battle on the Pacific, as well as the Eastern Front and Western fronts in Europe. There was also the advent during the war of a new weapon, the atomic weapon, the atomic bomb, which released a tremendous amount of power to destroy cities, as we saw in Hiroshima and in this picture from the mushroom cloud that formed up to 15 kilometers above Nagasaki. And so the president at the time, that's just in the middle of a war, was trying to decide what he should do. And Franklin Delano Roosevelt had been appointed as Assistant Secretary of the Navy by Woodrow Wilson during Wilson's term. And Roosevelt was a believer that we had to create an international system. and he wanted to create a United Nations. So he proposed the term for United Nations. And so it was off the coast of Newfoundland that the United Nations was created by those countries acting against the Allied powers. But the question was, do you create a completely new world order, or do you build on what you had with the League? And indeed, the international community decided to go with the model of the League. So the League Covenant became transformed into the UN Charter, was double the size in the UN Charter, but the basic provisions were the same, protecting the territorial integrity and political independence of member states. Not signed in Paris, in Versailles, but signed in San Francisco in order to get the US to become more involved. The country said, let's have the signing ceremony in San Francisco. And the League of Nations Assembly became the General Assembly. And the League Council became the Security Council of the UN. And the Mandates Commission, which was part of the decolonization, became the Trusteeship Council. And the International Court of Justice was renamed and still existed in The Hague as a judicial body to see cases between countries. The Geneva premises of the League became part of the UN, but headquarters moved to First Avenue on New York. And indeed, the properties of the League became part of the UN, and Lord Robert Cecil, who was the negotiator for the British of the League Covenant, went in 1946 in Geneva and said, "The League of Nations is dead, long live the United Nations." So the vision continued on. The Secretaries General, when we had the first League Secretary General, became the first UN Secretary General, Trygve Lie. We saw the tradition continue to this present day. And ironically, the grandson of Henry Cabot Lodge became the ambassador to the United Nations. And here he is submitting his papers to the Secretary General of the United Nations. And he worked to get the U.S. Senate Foreign Relations Committee to adopt the United Nations Charter. And the UN expanded till it created new agencies all around the world for civil aviation, maritime affairs, the atomic energy, food, the relief of peoples in Africa and South America, and labor organizations, trade and development, refugees, health, property, and the meteorological situation of the world. And the UN went into human rights with Eleanor Roosevelt taking a draft from a Canadian professor, John Humphrey, and chairing a committee that created the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. We saw the big test in Korea in 1950 when North Korea invaded with 90,000 troops into South Korea, and the UN was ready to respond, and the Security Council, in the absence of the Soviet Union, responded, and the Americans came on board realizing that this was a threat to their own security. They had learned the lessons of the isolationism of the 1930s. Then in 1956, the Secretary General actually had troops under his operational control. And here you see the Secretary General following a proposal by Canadian Prime Minister Lester Pearson to create the first peacekeeping force. And for that, Lester Pearson won the Nobel Peace Prize. Now there's over 100,000 personnel in the field who are under the control of the Secretary General working on peace operations all around the planet. On the judicial side, we saw the advent of courts, new courts, following the Nuremberg courts after the war. Then some 40 years later, we saw the advent of courts dealing with specific cases, and then the International Criminal Court, which is located in The Hague and does individual accountability, including heads of state can be tried before that court, subject to certain limitations there. Now, you may ask yourselves, where are we today with Syria, where there doesn't seem to be justice for those committing atrocities on the streets of Aleppo and Douma and in various locations all around Syria? And it's true, the Security Council is deadlocked. It's not good enough. We need a better world. We need a better world organization. And I'm going to propose to you in the last minute of my talk possible ideas to think about how we can make a better world for ourselves with greater justice and peace and freedom and prosperity. Now, the current structure is that nation states have legislative, executive, and judicial branches in their government. And currently it's the executive, that is the foreign ministries, who send representatives to the General Assembly of the UN, to the Security Council, and through the General Assembly, those same ambassadors vote for the judges in the International Court of Justice. Well, this is a very centralized mechanism through an executive, and it doesn't create checks and balances at the international system, and sometimes it creates gridlock, as we see in Syria. So a potential model to consider in the future is that we create a parliamentary body so that members of parliaments from our national bodies can go to an international body and they can meet in assembly there and pass resolutions and that have weight, just like the Security Council resolutions have weight today. And the executive forms some sort of World Council and Secretariat, and then you have an international court which can actually have checks and balances against the other two bodies in case they overexert themselves, in case they misapply force, in case they violate their own basic treaty that will govern them in the future. That's a model. Now I challenge you to think about how you'd like to live in our world in the future. What kind of world would you like, and how do you think the world should be governed? Should we follow the UN model for the next few centuries? Should we deal with some of the great threats like the threat of nuclear weapons? And how do we impose the international will on unwilling states? That's the great challenge for this century. And as human beings, we're challenged to say, how can we help make the UN a better organization, and how can we dream of a better organization than the United Nations to help make peace a greater reality? As we live on our planet with that thin atmosphere, only 2% of the diameter is our protection against the elements of space. How do we protect ourselves from fighting against ourselves so we can deal with the real threats to our planetary security? And I invite you to think with me about how to create a better world governance. Thank you very much.